Hi, everyone. Good evening. I see a few people are still joining, but we're going to start. My name is Gil Hochberg, and I'm the chair of MISA's Middle East, South Asian, and African Studies. It's a great delight for me to be here to chair this wonderful event. Today, we're going to discuss this very important book by Khatchig Mouradian, who is here with us. And just a few words about the book before I introduce our panelists, and I will then be quiet and enjoy with the rest of you our wonderful presentations. The Resistant Network, the Armenian Genocide and Humanitarian in Ottoman Syria, 1915 to 1918, is a book that offers a history of underground network of humanitarians, missionaries, diplomats in Ottoman Syria who helped save the lives of thousands during the Armenian Genocide. Professor Moradian challenges depictions of Armenians as passive victims of violence, as subjects of humanitarianism, and demonstrates the key role that they played in organizing a humanitarian resistance against the destruction of their people. Piecing together hundreds of accounts, official documents, missionary records, Professor Mouradian presents a social history of genocide and resistance in wartime Aleppo and the network of transit and concentration camps stretching from Bab Turas, ul-Ain, and Deir Zur. He ultimately argues that despite the violence and the systematic mechanisms of control in the cities, the concentration camps, and despite the massacre sites in the entire region, the genocide of the Armenians did not progress unhindered, and that armed resistance proved as an important factor in saving countless of lives. Of course, this is a very important contribution to the field of Armenian studies and to the field of genocide studies in more generally speaking. With us tonight, in addition to Khatchig Mouradian, who is currently a lecturer in MISAS, and I do want to say as chair of MISAS that I have never in my life read such enthusiastic reports of teaching. And this is besides the point of the book, but really it is remarkable. Students are just admire Professor Mouradian's teaching, and we are blessed to have him in our department. He's also currently the editor of the peer-reviewed journal, the Armenian Review, and in addition to the book is a author of many articles on genocide, mass violence, and unarmed resistance. With us today, in the order of presentation, Ellis I did practice the last names. Here we go. Mouradian. I am very apologetic if I am mispronouncing. Professor of Islamic, World, and Middle East History in Whitman College. She is the author of the Straight Path, Illicit Sex, Law, and Community in Ottoman Aleppo, published by Sycamore University Press, 2008. This is a title that definitely captured my attention, and I immediately ordered the book, as well as several articles on gender, non-Muslims, and the law in Ottoman Empire. Also with us, Margaret Lavinia Anderson, Professor Emerita of Modern History at the University of California, Berkeley, the author of Windthorst, A Political Biography, Practicing Democracy, Election, and Political Culture in Imperial Germany, among many other publications. And last but not least, Professor Hamid Dabashi, my own colleague, the Khatchig Mouradian Professor of Iranian Studies and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. Professor Dabashi has published a mere 22 books. We will not ask him how he does that, but somehow he does. He's also edited many others and contributed many other publications. essays, articles on Iranian studies, medieval, modern Islam, contemporary literature, and world cinema and philosophy of art. It is a great pleasure for me to host this esteemed and promising collective, and I will move directly. We will start with Professor Mouradian's presentation. Thank you and enjoy the presentations.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you to the organizers and everyone here, colleagues and friends who have joined this panel, as well as everyone who has joined and is following us and following the discussion. I'd like to start by, saying that although this is not the first book event that I have done, those of you who follow me on social media may have seen a number of events and interviews. This is particularly dear to my heart. Colombia and Misas have been my intellectual home over the past 5 years. And so this is, it brings me great pleasure to be here and to be joined by my fellow panelists. It is also doesn't hurt to have an opportunity to put a suit jacket on in these times. I'd like to thank a few other individuals that I think their role was phenomenal. I believe they are all on my dissertation committee. Professors Taner Akçam, Deborah Dwork, and Raymond Kevorkian for their insights, for their generosity. I am indebted forever. And also to the series editor, Ara Sanjan, and again for his mentorship and guidance. In 2009, a year and a half before civil war in Syria erupted, I visited the region where many Armenians refer to as the ground zero or the Auschwitz of the Armenian Genocide, Deir ez-Zor. And standing there, one of my colleagues accompanying me pointed out how, standing in the middle of the desert in Deir ez-Zor, there were these signs, one pointing in the direction of Iraq, another pointing in the direction of Lebanon, another pointing in the direction of other directions in Syria within the country. And one of the thoughts that emerged, one of the discussions that emerged at that point was about the layers of violence that have haunted that region for the past century. And in fact, one of the places we visited on that trip in 2009 was a mass grave in Deir ez-Zor, where that was right next to a school in a village. And the school children used that mass grave, that mound, as their playground. And as we scratched the surface of the soil, bones and pieces of bones were protruding, and the children started bringing these bones to us, collecting them and bringing them. And when we asked them, what are these? They would say, Armani, Armenians. In many ways, and I will come back to this later, I often think about these children and where they ended up. I have a photograph of them on top of that mound with those bones in their hands. Deir ez-Zor specifically became one of the flashpoints of the war in Syria. And I don't know where those children have ended up. And in many ways, those layers of violence still haunt us to this day. But in the summer of 1916, this town, Deir ez-Zor, in the fringes of a crumbling empire, became a synonym for the deportation, dispossession, and destruction of the Armenians. Away from the eyes of the world, the sands of Deir ez-Zor crystallized the affliction of a nation. And generations of Armenians adopted the town as a synonym for the indescribable. For over a century, scholars have seem to have largely avoided retracing the path to their Zor. Attempting to make sense of the complex history of the extirpation of the Armenians in Syria proved to be a challenge. To this day, the destruction of the Armenian deportees who had arrived in Ottoman Syria through, though central to the history of the genocide and omnipresent in the survivor accounts and memoirs, remains understudied. With few exceptions, all we had were snippets, overviews, and summaries of what transpired. This void in Armenian genocide historiography was due to a combination of methodological challenges, political realities, and the inaccessibility of crucial primary sources. In the face of the Turkish state's aggressive genocide denial campaigns, the scholarship and public discourse on the Armenian genocide have focused on the victimization and destruction of Armenians, often ignoring the historical record on Armenian mobilization and resistance. It is as if by granting perpetrators absolute power, the case for asserting the veracity of the genocide were strengthened. The scholarship on the wartime and interwar Western humanitarian efforts has also has its blind spots. It largely misses the connections Western humanitarians forged with local Christians and Muslims and arriving deportees, and the central role these Ottoman subjects themselves played in the humanitarian work. Armenians and others not only launched an extensive effort months before relief funds started flowing from the United States and Europe, but also took upon themselves the task of distributing aid to deportees beyond the reach of consuls and missionaries, with Armenian couriers carrying funds or supplies to areas and encampments as far away as Idlib, Marra, Deir Zor. Again, many of these names we have heard and we've been hearing in recent years in the context of the war in Syria. In the resistance network, I challenge explicit and implicit depictions of Armenians as passive recipients of violence on the one hand and of Western humanitarian assistance on the other. The scholarship and the public discourse largely define the perpetrators and Western humanitarians, but not the targeted group, as actors, focusing on how the former killed and the latter saved. Yet our understanding of the dynamics of mass violence would be flawed without fully integrating the targeted group's responses into the narrative. Although the genocidal machine aims to maximize the very power asymmetry that propels it, it cannot erase the opposition of the victims as individuals and as a group. Zooming in on one region of the Ottoman Empire during the Great War, I demonstrate how Armenians coordinated a robust humanitarian resistance effort. And they did this as soon as the Committee of Union and Progress enacted the empire-wide deportations, arrests, and massacres in the spring of 1915. And there was a range of responses, and I emphasize a range here because not everybody is resisting. Not all resistance is armed resistance, and it's important to emphasize this element here. But Armenians organized clandestine chains of communication between the Ottoman provinces, Istanbul, and European countries. Others created groups that procured, transferred, and distributed funds, food, and medication to exiles, saved them from sexual slavery, created safe houses and underground orphanages, and upheld deportee morale as hundreds of communities were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands and marched in the direction of Syria. In the resistance network, I explored the role of an indigenous, organized, and sustained effort to help deportees led by Aleppo's Armenian community. This effort was in full swing 4 months ahead of the establishment of the Armenian Relief Committee in the United States in September 1915. This is the predecessor to Near East Relief. These groups were loosely interlinked, operating out of cities where a population was only partly deported and along railroad lines stretching from Istanbul to Konya, Aleppo, ul-Ain, and beyond. In the resistance network, I situate resistance within a range of victim responses. uh, including exploitation of and profiteering from fellow Armenians, corruption and misappropriation of humanitarian assistance, collaboration with Turkish authorities, gendarmes, police, and even post office officials in order to denounce, extort, deport, and in rare cases, sexually abuse and even kill deportees. As such, this is not a hagiography of resistors, nor an attempt to glorify victims, and to quote here historian John Cox, by exaggerating resistance, which can imply condemnation of those who did not resist. So in many ways, as I look at unarmed Armenian resistance in the region that I cover in the book, within this range of responses. And I review just a few words about how I think about the Armenian genocide in this context. I view the Armenian genocide as a centrally planned destruction of organized Armenian life, shaped by local particularities and ad hoc measures, with the center intervening when the process encountered hindrances, slowed down, or progressed too overtly. Spurred by an exclusionist ideology and a drive to homogenize a crumbling empire, and citing wartime security measures and military necessity, the ruling Committee of Union and Progress codified into law its decision to uproot, dispossess, and destroy Armenian communities. Initially, local authorities implemented these laws and parallel orders of massacres with varying enthusiasm, resulting in reassignments, firings, courts martial, and in cases like, for example, the mayor of Lice, Hussein Nassimi, the murders of recalcitrant officials. In this environment, efforts to save Armenians were often conducted against the law or against the will of the central authorities. And this is how I define resistance. I define resistance as actions carried out illegally or against the sanction and will of the authorities to save Armenian deportees from annihilation. And it's important here to note that although at the core of this resistance network is the Aleppo Armenian community, a small community of 10,000 in the beginning of the war, and many missionaries and diplomats who are in the region, it's also striking that how fast some deportees were arriving in Syria from across the Ottoman Empire, and despite the risks involved and their unfamiliarity with the region, with the language, many of these newcomers do not know Arabic, for example, they immediately take on roles in this network of humanitarian action. One example is Reverend Aharon Shirajian. He is on the cover photo of the book. He knew what it meant, for example, in his case, to challenge the authorities. He had been imprisoned and tortured in 1895. Yet soon after his convoy arrived in Aleppo from Marash in the spring of 1915, he took the helm of an orphanage that sheltered thousands of children and did not give in despite harassment and repeated arrests. And ultimately, I show in the book that the resistance network, how it maximizes the use of the built environment as it works to save deportees, how Armenian churches, schools, institutions become focal points of community mobilization and deportee support. I zoom in and focus on certain hospitals, hotels, and other businesses that are owned by local Armenians in Aleppo. And as I do this, I also explore the efforts of this network across the entire region. And as I do this, I highlight, for example, the role of women in this effort, be it in Aleppo itself or in concentration camps across along the lower bend of the Euphrates from Meskene all the way to Deir Zor. I highlight and I demonstrate how the farther away we go from these organized structures and institutions, the role of women becomes even more prominent. Many of the committees that are formed initially in Aleppo to help the deportees were overwhelmingly, or exclusively in fact, made up of men. Yet, as the book demonstrates, outside of this and loosely connected to this network were many women who play a critical role, both in terms of saving deportees and in terms of communicating what is going on to missionaries, diplomats, who in turn conveyed these reports to the world. So over the past decades, hundreds of accounts, memoirs, monographs, and scholarly articles and books dedicated to Western humanitarians serving in the Ottoman Empire have been published in many languages. Numerous events organized by survivors, their children, and grandchildren around the world have honored these humanitarians. But the couriers, the people on the ground, mostly Armenians, but also others, Christians, Muslims, and Jewish people of the Ottoman Empire, who, in the words of one witness, at the risk of their lives and the cost of 1,000 sacrifices, have helped and relieved thousands of exiles starving in the deserts, end quote. They have received little attention, and this book connects them all. In doing so, it demonstrates how much is suppressed from the narrative when the actions and words of the targeted groups are relegated to the margins. The network I examine challenges conventional thinking about mass violence, the targeted group's reaction to it, and intervention. It demonstrates the role community structures and key connectors can play when a group is under attack, and the importance of working with them, with the local population, not putting them to work in devising and implementing any form of humanitarian action. And in that sense, I also in that sense, I think about those children that I met in Deir ez-Zor in 2009. I think and ask myself where they ended up, which camp, which refugee camp, or in which country, and how are they being treated? How are they being viewed? How is the world of humanitarianism today thinking about the way we interact with people who have been caught in the miasma of war and mass violence? And what is the legacy and the lessons of cases such as the Armenian Genocide in terms of our understanding and appreciation of the role and the voices of the victims? Thank you very much.
So I believe it's my turn next, and I would really like to thank you for having me here this evening to celebrate Khatchig's book, The Resistance Network. I'll speak primarily to how this work contributes to Armenian, Ottoman, and Syrian studies, but I also don't want to lose sight of his contributions to genocide studies, particularly the comparative study of concentration camps and the history of humanitarianism. My primary aim in these brief remarks is to focus on how Khatchig's study enriches our understanding of the category of victim in the Armenian Genocide, and he's already illustrated that so well with bringing in our Syrian victims during the civil war into his introduction this evening. The Armenian Genocide took place from 1915 to 1918 and extended into more ethnic cleansing afterward, when Armenians who returned to their homelands were exiled yet again, as boundaries were redrawn during what is known as the Turkish War of Independence. The major outcome of Kemalist Turkey was that the genocide would be denied as a matter of state policy. Turkish ethno-nationalism would be constituted in part through genocide denial and the vilification of minorities, particularly Armenians and by extension Kurds, as treacherous enemies of the state. State restrictions on free speech has shaped the field of Armenian genocide studies in ways that Khatchig has already alluded to. A great deal of scholarly energy outside of Turkey has been spent on proving the genocide happened, and Ottoman sources were determined to be the most important determinant for the state of Turkey, and so heavy reliance on Ottoman sources as much as possible shaped the field. This has impacted the way that first-person testimony and Armenian sources were repeatedly maligned by Turkish historians as tall tales or fabrications, a double violation of survivor testimony. I want to note how the rich archive of victim testimony known as the Andonian documents were subject to such attack in the past, And it's here that the Resistance Network, we see Khatchig mining the source to successfully write a history of the Armenian genocide from below, from the margins. And in this way, he contextualizes this eyewitness testimony by placing it side by side with Ottoman state sources. So I'm sure you can appreciate how this particular burden has stunted the growth of Armenian genocide studies. But in the last few years, we can see how the field is really coming into its own and asking new historical questions beyond proving whether or not the genocide happened. That brings exciting opportunities for dialogue with other fields and comparative studies of genocide evidenced in this diverse panel tonight. In order to prove that the genocide happened and that Armenians were wronged, scholars have had to prove that Armenians were first and foremost victims. This is ironic since, as Khatchig notes so well, Der Zor is full of bones. In the Turkish narrative, Armenians got what they deserved because they betrayed the state during isolated cases of rebellion against the April 1915 deportation orders. That is to say, because Armenians did not always die passively, moments in which they showed agency or resistance has been weaponized in this political battle over the memory of the Armenian genocide. And this oft-repeated charge levied against Armenians, it's akin to thinking of a situation in which one blamed or vilified Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising for not passively boarding the trains to Auschwitz. Of course, with state-imposed amnesia, few Turks have a context to better understand that deportation to Der Zor, as you learned so well in Khatchig's book, was a death sentence. This is all the more reason why this book must be published in Turkish. The Resistance Network does not use this flattened definition of victim from previous generations' historiography, and instead he gives victims flesh and bone. He provides a nuance. He provides nuance by showing how, in some cases, Armenian deportees used their tent poles to fight off Chechens, leading them on horseback along the Khabur River just north of Der Zor. Importantly, we learn how grassroots Armenian humanitarianism was at work to save the lives of deportees, the harrowing lengths Armenians went to transmit information, creating human newsletters by writing important life-saving messages on the bodies of often children couriers. In other cases, they tied messages to their body parts, carrying them in secret. In short, the sources Khatchig uses offer many missing details to the story of Armenian survival. I've personally been tracking the role of Muslim muleteers who were transporting victims to various hubs where they could be rescued. So there's this whole network of muleteers throughout eastern Syria that are helping Armenians escape and find safety in places like Aleppo. So there are so many tiny details that we've yet to write as historians. Khatchig's book reminds me of Primo Levi's testimony from Auschwitz that detailed how the camp is a gray zone, and it's in the space where that line between victim and perpetrator can be blurred in the painful memory of the Sonderkommando, or the Jewish collaborator. In Khatchig's work, we learn of Armenian collaborators, the Armenians who occupied that gray zone and betrayed their own people to survive. They did things including procure women for the purpose of sexual abuse. Include these Armenian collaborators, and their inclusion in the story works to complicate yet again that experience of the victim community, making them more human by exposing the conditions of precarity that facilitated collaboration. The Resistance Network brings into relief also the calculations made to bring about large-scale death through extreme deprivation in the desert. Here we learn that there was more than a single deportation, but re-deportation that diminished chances of survival, that advanced, what we could think of as a production of the corpse, that is the goal of genocide. The conditions of the Syrian desert cannot be underestimated. It was designed, deportation there was designed to make life untenable by weaponizing the environment. The desert, with extreme heat by day and extreme cold by night, produced what Jason De Leon has called in his study of the US-Mexican border necro-violence. That's violence that's produced through a combination of human and non-human actants in the desert: heat, wild dogs, carrion, disease, and ultimately time. And it was the clandestine network of humanitarian resistance that Khatchig vividly describes that were one of the few means by which unclothed, unfed, unsheltered, half alive Armenian deportees were given a chance at survival. These networks inside Syria, outlined so clearly in Khatchig's work, were from previous diasporas. And as he notes, those Armenian populations of Syria were spared largely the deportation. Those 10,000 local Aleppo Armenians, for example, that he referred to in the introduction. These Armenian merchant communities had settled along historic pilgrimage routes for centuries, especially along the Silk Road. Through their organizing, we get a glimpse of the Syrian Armenian community that received their brothers and sisters in Aleppo. The prelacy in Aleppo, the Armenian Protestant Church, the Armenian Catholics, and many more give us a vivid example of the city of Aleppo that's on the brink as it receives over 100,000 Armenians during the Armenian Genocide. In fact, Aleppo as a city is no longer able to support its population with food and shelter during what is referred to as a housing famine in League of Nations records at that time. And yet Aleppo Armenians found a place for refugees in the text then that we learn not about humanitarian assistance, a topic on which historians of the Armenian Genocide have written, but humanitarian resistance. That is the way in which local Armenian resistance networks were actively organizing to counter the campaign of death that had befallen their fellow Armenians. Examples include disguising themselves to sneak into concentration camps to provide Armenians with food, money, and medical assistance. We learn how within the concentration camps, Armenians had organized their own networks for sanitation, burial of the dead, and ad hoc medical care in order to protect the living from disease. Armenian sources offer such vivid examples, bottom-up history from the perspective of victims. The case for Armenian sources for the study of not only the genocide, but the history of Aleppo and the Ottoman Empire are invaluable and display why it's important for more scholars of the region to use them, and they are. So one of the questions I have for Khatchig is to ask about access to Armenian sources, especially since so many of the church's archives were imperiled by war in Syria or are closed. Do you have any thoughts about what scholars may be able to do with these sources in the future, and how you may be thinking about directions Armenian genocide studies could go next, now that you've brought us to this place of thinking about victimhood in a nuanced way? Finally, I have a more contemporary question. Do you have any thoughts about how resistance, often celebrated in the case of the Holocaust, continues to be a narrative of vilification of Armenians in Turkish politics? And I'm thinking particularly of how Turkey and Azerbaijan recently framed Armenian resistance as aggression or even terrorism during the war in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh last fall. Thank you.
Great. Okay, me? Well, I'm a relative newcomer to the Middle East. My own training and expertise in earlier work field was Europe, of which I would say Turkey was a part really until 1923. But when I began becoming interested in the Armenian genocide, my template was naturally the Shoah. But early on in my research, I came upon one contradiction after another. And actually the first time I met Khatchig, he interviewed me when he was a journalist in his previous life. And I think I certainly relayed my shock about a couple of things I will mention to you. Reading the documents in the German Foreign Office, I found German consuls constantly protesting against their Turkish allies, refusing to cooperate with the genocide, some tactfully and carefully, and others quite outspokenly. And Khatchig has mentioned the consul of Aleppo, Walter Rüssler, who was a good guy and worked very hard, but much more vehement in his opposition to Turkish Armenian policy and his insistence that his own government intervene and do something. And someone who protected his Armenian staff members was the German acting consul at Erzurum, 31-year-old Max Erwin von Scheubner-Richter. Well, as a German historian, I knew all about Scheubner-Richter because in 1923, he was killed in Munich on the Odeonsplatz at Hitler's side in the failed beer hall putsch. So here is this humanitarian about whom at his death, Hitler said that his loss is irreplaceable. And excuse me, I have to plug my laptop in. It's now telling me it's out of gas. His replacement at Erzurum in 1916 was Friedrich Werner Graf, that is Count von Schulenburg, a man cut from entirely different cloth. And when people told him that this used to be a center of Armenian population and they'd all been killed and it was terrible, he poo-pooed these stories. He said, look, they're none. I don't see anything like that happening now. And in any case, we know Orientals, that was his term, they're always exaggerating everything. Now this man died in 1944. He was hanged with piano wire in the Plotzensee prison in Berlin for his role in the plot to kill Hitler. So these were the kinds of things I was running up against when I was looking into the Armenian Genocide. And what most astonishes me about Khatchig's book, and what I love the most about it, is that he breaks through any kind of presuppositions you might think before you start reading, except of course he tells you that he's going to do this, but still. And certainly he puts paid to any kind of easy comparisons to the Shoah. He really breaks the mold there. And for genocide studies, I think this will be very useful because we can't always be thinking about the Shoah. It is different. For one thing, the Germans did it, not the Turks. But just as much as he breaks the mold of what I'm expecting from the German example, he breaks the mold from what I'm expecting in the Anatolian example. So reading about the Armenian consul in Aleppo, and those early chapters are really, to me, the most startling, because here we have an embedded Armenian community working with local officials, local small town officials, but also on the provincial level, working to save Armenians. And the degree of cooperation among, as Khatchig points out, among the different Armenian communities, but also the level of respect in which they are held by their surrounding, I would guess, Arab co-citizens, setting up orphanages, getting support for deportees that are landing. And we know in America, nobody really wants an asylum seeker nearby, and certainly these people aren't even seeking asylum, they're just dumped there. And yet the cooperation within Aleppo and the leadership and cooperation among the Armenians is really astonishing. And the fact that the local Aleppan Armenians do not imagine initially that they're going to be slotted for deportation too. How secure they feel is also really startling to me. And I compare it with Bitlis. The provincial governor at Bitlis, Abdul Halik, suggested in a phone call to Istanbul, and maybe it was a telegram, I can't remember, on April 18th, 1915, that the extermination, I'm quoting, of these elements is required right now for the security of the state. So he has it already in mind. And that July, the massacre of Bitlis Armenians was so fast and furious that they didn't get deported. None of them got deported. And all the males in the capital city of Bitlis, called Bitlis, were killed within 4 days. This was fast and furious and then over. Or we go to Aintab, and there, and I'm drawing here on Umit Kurt and Bitlis, I'm drawing on Mehmet Polatel. This is not my research. We go to Aintab, and there the town's elite is contacting Istanbul and saying, please, please, deport our Armenians. Now, these Armenians are upper middle class people like they are. They're not somehow supported locally. They're not integrated locally. This town can't get rid of them fast enough. So when you then go to Aleppo and see what they are doing with Armenian leadership, but with local support, you think of this as charity in the original sense of the term, caritas, love. And then these deportees come bringing typhus. They're dangerous. Also, you have to remember that in 1915, the grasshoppers who come to Syria, there is a huge famine. The British are blockading Syria. There is a famine aided by blockade, and yet the support really goes on. So the success of the Armenian Council, its integration with local elites, the story of the Hotel Baron, if that's how we pronounce it, the story of the Armenian Hospital, these heroes, but these heroes who have managed to get good neighbors, I think makes Khatchig's story, for all of its horrors and for all of the tragedy, maybe makes the tragedy even more tragic, is nevertheless one that leaves you with a kind of success story. The success story of Armenian resilience, but also of some, and in the case of Aleppo, local cooperation. And I wanted to ask him the question, are Arabs just different from Turks? Or is it the Kurd plus Turks that makes Eastern Anatolia so toxic? While you have to say that in Syria, the murder is imported. Now, as the story goes on to 1916 and on, then you see local cooperation and you see naturally the bad rise to the top. But really, it does raise that question. One of the things I would really also recommend about this book is Khatchig comes down very strongly on the Jamal Pasha question. I won't tell you what his answer is, but he marshals in a very brilliant and clear-cut way all of the evidence about his being opposed to the Armenian genocide and the fact that he helped this one and that one and the other one. And then all of the evidence that he supported the CUP's policy of basically ethnic cleansing, if not murder as for the one. And I won't tell you what his answer is, but I think it's a wonderful contribution to his book. In any case, I have to conclude, if I may. I would say, by the way, this book is also a contribution to the humanities. I hear the humanities are in bad straits now and everyone's looking for a way to earn more money and do more startups. But this is the story of a man who contributes to literature. And therefore, I will close by borrowing from Tolstoy, but how shall I say, amended for this case. Every happy society is alike, but every genocidal society is different, each in its own way. So thank you, Khatchig.
Okay, so I assume I'm being heard, Gil? Good. Well, first and foremost, my gratitude to Khatchig to include me in this conversation. And because I am not a specialist of Armenia, perhaps the question my contribution should begin by saying, why is it that when Khatchig kindly asked me, I'm sure he has had his own reasons to invite me to this conversation, I immediately accepted. My reasons are both personal and professional. And because I was born and raised in a Muslim country as a Muslim, but within an Armenian community, within 2 blocks of an Armenian church and an Armenian school, and about which I have written repeatedly, I bring a perspective on the question of Armenians in Turkey, in Iran, in the Arab world, and in Central Asia, etc., that perhaps opens up the frame a little bit for us to come and concentrate on the question of genocide. To begin with, Khatchig repeatedly emphasizes in his book that he is interested in nonviolent resistance to the genocide. I must put it on the table that I have absolutely nothing against violent resistance to genocide. One of the glorious moments of the World War II is the Warsaw Ghetto uprisings that has remained with us. So our deliberations, conversation about nonviolence, I'm all appreciative of that, doesn't imply that violent resistance to genocide is something to be dismissed. The other part of it is going back to the beginning with personal and coming to professional. As Gil, my chairperson, said, the very chair on which I'm sitting, Hagop Gevorkian, professor of Iranian studies, was established by our Armenian art connoisseur, an Armenian archaeologist from Turkey. And the question is, why would an Armenian from Turkey who lived in New York and was an art collector and was very successful, gave this chair to Columbia University to establish endowed chair for Iranian studies? And this can go on and back and forth into various moments in the history of my own academic career, when I have come accidentally by serendipity to the question of Armenian genocide. I give you a couple of examples. In the 1980s in Geneva, I was interviewing a very prominent member of Iranian literary history, Muhammad Ali Jamalzadeh, who was almost completely deaf at the time. He lived a very long life. He was born in 1892 and died in 1997. So he lived to be 105 years old. And I interviewed him when he was in his 80s. And I had nothing, this conversation had nothing to do with Armenian anything. So he was part of a group of intellectuals, Iranian intellectuals in Berlin during World War I, that he was sent to Baghdad for some mission. And he was just reminiscing to me about his coming back from Baghdad to Berlin right around 1917. And then suddenly he began to shake, old man began to shake, and tears coming from his eyes, telling me how he was sitting in the back of a cart and going backward like this in Anatolia. And then he said, I began to see blonde heads chopped off, blonde hair chopped off. So this image of blonde heads chopped off kept preoccupying him, and he lost consistency of his thinking. So for about half an hour, he just kept talking about his eyewitness account of seeing Armenian genocide happening at the moment that it was happening. I have told Khatchig that I subsequently gave that tape to our Armenian oral history collection that I thought perhaps becomes important. Just about the same time, in terms of contrast between the Armenian community in Iran and Armenian community in the Ottoman period, it is very crucial to keep in mind that the Armenians of the turn of the century in Iran were integral to the constitutional revolution. The figure of Yepram Khan is a celebrated figure in terms of his contribution to the constitutional revolution, a turning point in modern Iranian history. So the question is, how much sense of belonging should an Armenian revolutionary have in the future of a country in which he and his fellow Armenians lived, to be part of a revolutionary uprising? Then this brings me to another important, which is not connected to politics, but to art. We have a very prominent Armenian-Iranian filmmaker, Arbi Ovanesyan, who lives in Paris. And Arbi was one of the founding figures of our modern new wave Iranian cinema. He and I were part of a seminar in Oslo years ago, maybe 2 decades ago, about the emergence of modern theater in Iran. And Ibsen, the conference was about Henrik Ibsen. And what was absolutely flabbergasting was the role of Armenian dramatists and intellectuals and translators in translating Ibsen into Armenian before it was then translated into Persian and became integral, one of the earliest, Enemy of the People, Dollhouse, etc. So the intermediary function of Armenian community, and now we're talking about Central Asia, we're not just talking about Iran and the Arab world, in emergence of modernity or intellectual modernity or artistic modernity or political modernity, all of these aspects is in sharp contrast with what we know and discuss about the Armenian genocide. The immediately related to it, while today we had a discussion about a colleague who is into film studies, so my mind is in film studies, the role of Sergei Parajanov, Soviet Armenian filmmaker, monumental impact that he has had on the regional cinema, not just the Soviet cinema and Russian cinema and Armenian cinema, obviously, but Iranian cinema, Arab cinema, etc. The figure of Parajanov is not just, oh, okay, he was an Armenian filmmaker. He was an author of monumental significance. This I remember years ago, maybe 20 years ago, when Atom Egoyan made his movie, Ararat, about Armenian genocide, and we invited Adam to come to Colombia. We showed his film and celebrated his achievements. One of the key issues that emerged in the discussion of Atom Egoyan's movie Ararat was the sort of post-structuralist and deconstructive way that he did the Armenian genocide. Is a film within a film. So I always said, after Atom Egoyan's a movie on Armenian genocide, it is impossible to talk about genocide in a way that is compelling and convincing. And then I began to compare it, for example, with the way Elias Suleiman has done Nakba in Palestinian context, or the way that from the generation of Gilo Pontocorvo, who did one of his earlier films on Holocaust, then how do we convey the horror and the tragedy and the colossal monumentality of an event like Armenian genocide, Jewish Holocaust, etc., becomes a contribution of Atom Egoyan to a larger context that he was able, precisely because of his deconstructive method, to do a film on Armenian genocide that becomes exemplary for others. Now, I began to read Khatchig's book in this particular frame of reference, and I want to raise just one question for him to consider, and the question is as follows. I was reading the book and coming across multiple wonderful points that he's making until I came to this point, this short paragraph, beginning of a paragraph, which I'm going to quote. Historian Yaron Ayalan argues that whenever disaster struck in the Ottoman Empire, one's community stood as the primary venue for seeking and providing aid. All the more so for non-Muslims, for whom religious institutions, quote, fulfilled some of the needs the state did for Muslims, end of quote. Indeed, the small Armenian community, now this is Khatchig talking, indeed, the small Armenian community of Aleppo immediately organized relief committees to help the Armenian survivors who had arrived in Syria, end of quote. So the argument that both the scholar that Khatchig quotes and then his own commentary is that there are these communities, Christian communities, Armenian communities, Jewish communities, that the community functions as a protection of the individual vis-a-vis the state that gives that protection to Muslims. And as soon as I read that, I asked myself, and now I'm asking Khatchig, really? The states protect Muslims?
Yeah, that part, yeah.
When did any state protect any Muslim? And in fact, precisely the point that Khatchig raises about religious sites becoming a protection for Armenians, we have precisely that institution in Islam and for Muslims and for Shiis. We call it bast. When a revolutionary, an activist, somebody who has been accused of a crime seeks protection, which we call it in Persian bast nishistan, within a mausoleum, religious figures aside, in order to protect himself or herself against the state. So this became a premise for me to think that beyond the documentation of the Armenian genocide for its own reasons, because it's a horror of human history and has to be documented, violent resistance, non-violent resistance, and one of the best aspects of Khatchig's is when he connects with genocide, with Holocaust studies, and learns from it and engages with it. But I think there is something larger at stake that is happening. That is the particular targeting of the Armenian communities or the Jewish communities or the Baha'i communities or right now today in China or in Myanmar or Muslim communities, etc. These are the failures of the state to create and sustain citizenship.
Monopoly of violence.
And I would now draw your attention, and particularly Khatchig's, to Nazi Germany and the process that my colleague Professor Anderson knows better. They call Gleichschaltung, namely elimination of any existing what Tocqueville called voluntary associations that stand between the atomized individual and the totalizing tendency of the state. And the Armenian church or the Jewish synagogue, or now I include any independent Muslim endowment, independent of the state, becomes that's voluntary association that protects the individual against the totalizing tendency of the state. To make a long story short, I started reading and writing and so forth. The point that we have is between the possibility of sort of Gemeinschaft communities standing between the individual, atomized individual, and the Gesellschaft claims of the totalizing the state. This opens up the genocide studies and Holocaust studies for that matter, that the sin of the Armenians or the sin of the Jews or now Muslims in Myanmar or anywhere else is that they provide a community, a Gemeinschaft gathering. And this is why when Khatchig was talking about network, I wish he had gone to Zimmel's notion of a web of group affiliation, because multiple times Khatchig refers to Muslims coming to the aids or even Ottoman Turks coming to the help. So that opens up the possibility of network, not by ethnicizing them. Obviously, Armenians have a particular reason to protect Armenians. There is no doubt. But when you have Muslims, when you have Turks, when you have Arabs, when you have others coming to join, then you have the formation of what Zimmel calls a web of group affiliation that goes beyond ethnicity. It goes beyond, and that is where the sovereignty of the nation or the sovereignty of multiple nations come to play against the totalizing tendency of the state, whether it's in Nazi Germany or the late Ottoman period or China or Myanmar or whatever, makes no difference. Namely, existence of small Gemeinschaft communities that can protect the individual. This, my modest contribution, Khatchig, to your wonderful book that I was happy, I mean, it's not possible to say it was a pleasant reading to talk about Armenian genocide, but I was happy to see one of my colleagues so deeply involved and remind me of of all my wonderful memories of my, in a recent interview, I tell you this, Khatchig, and I conclude. In a recent interview, I was asked, what did you want to be when you were a child? I said, I wanted to become an Armenian bartender. So what the hell is that? I said, no, but in my hometown, all the bars that gave alcoholic beverages and my older brother used to go were Armenian. They did impeccable cooking, beautiful, wonderful, delicious food, and wine and vodka and so forth. And also, these Armenian bartenders were exquisite conversationalists. They could talk about anything. And then I concluded and say, I believe I succeeded to become an Armenian bartender as a professor at Columbia. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamid. In fact, well, perhaps now you answered why I invited you. You asked the question, you answered it yourself. So thank you, Hamid. Thank you, Elise. Thank you, Peggy and Gil. Let me start, in fact, with one of the points that you made, Hamid, and then make my way back. In fact, I do think that what you're saying is critical here in terms of not seeing this as a community, being an Armenian community, it's like in some kind of enclosed factor. And I believe that is the central drive, sort of, that led me to first not make a distinction between Armenians. I use the word humanitarian across the board. I don't say, well, if you are Armenian, you're helping Armenians, you fall into a different category and then start, trying to divide people based on where exactly they fall and what is the gray area, right? So the way in which I think of the network is groups of human beings who are in this region who are coming together in order to assist Armenians. They happen to be led by institutions initially. That institutional structure breaks down the farther away you go. So I think what the point you're making, and is well taken, is something that I very much subscribe to. Not only that, but when I think about the way in which I view this kind of essentially, I use a similar framework when I think about perpetrators, victims, right, and again, those who are in that gray area. Now, it is interesting to see, and perhaps I don't know if this was possible to predict, how some of the comments and questions by all three sort of touched on distinctions between different groups. And I want to say that my position on it is a little bit, it's a lot trickier in terms of the different distinction between Arabs, Turks, and Kurds, etc. If I would make a distinction, I would make a distinction between dynamics that are other, such as the economic environment, the regions that we're looking at. Peggy highlighted 3 cases that really illustrate this. For example, Bitlis, Aintab, and Aleppo. And I would say even more so, a place like Raqqa, where what you have is, thousands of Armenians are allowed into the city. And by essentially, initially, this is a decision that has to do very much with bribes. And then they become, within months, they become an integral part of the community. And when in 1916, in the summer of 1916, there's a push by the central authorities to deport the Armenians in Raqqa, while just a few dozen kilometers south of the, to the south and southeast, the resort massacres are taking place. The local authorities refuse to hand over the Armenians. And so it is an interesting dynamic where, it's very difficult for us to make these decisions and distinctions just looking at, one particular motivation or one particular drive or even one particular community. Another thing that would complicate this is that, yes, in many ways that I do demonstrate how in Aleppo, there was a community there was a Muslim community that was very supportive. But at the same time, including, by the way, Muslim Turks, right? But at the same time, I also, complicated in the final chapter where I talk about 1919, 1920 and the pogrom against Armenians in Aleppo.
Yeah.
After the Turkish defeat and withdrawal. So that's another complicating factor. By the way, again, that pogrom against Armenians is not something that is discussed. It's been relegated. Recently it was the 100th anniversary of it. Nobody really discussed it because
you don't want to know.
Doesn't fit the dominant narrative in that regard. But in that sense, again, the role of the Kurds is also complicated, right? There's some scholarship coming out now, essentially stripping Kurds of agency, saying that they were just following their leaders. And in many ways, it's the opposite of what I'm trying to do, is giving Armenians agency. And there's a scholarship out there that's trying to strip Kurds of agency, saying that they're following their tribal leaders, etc. And this is in turn also, I believe, problematic, right? In that regard. So a few words about a couple other things. One is, again, there's a few comments that Elise made that I want to go back to and questions and try to be as brief as possible. The notion of, and again, this connects with some of the things that Elise said to Hamid's comment as well about violent resistance, right? And in many ways, Elise's question about that and about how it feels like even in the here and now, people often would like, even when they're trying to intervene, sign petitions, engage in any kind of action, people would like to see this kind of image of innocence, of absolute total victimhood, in order to take a position on that. Not only because they worry about it being a murky area, for example, what happened in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, but also because I feel like it makes them feel better about themselves. When there's this abject helplessness, and then you are extending, and it almost is, and this is in many ways, perhaps if we zoom out a little bit, a challenge in the way in which we think about human rights activism and humanitarian action in general, by the way. The way in which we oftentimes, the reports of many human rights organizations every other paragraph will make us think, all right, I wonder if there's people on the ground who are actually doing this work. I wonder who, and these are the very questions that were very central for me as I'm looking at this history and trying to tackle the way it is represented, is seeing much of this also playing out in the here and now. So perhaps that is another thing that sort of connects some of the comments. And maybe I should stop here, and so that we have at least a little bit of time for comments from the participants. Thank you all again for your contributions.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. This was really fascinating to hear. I also have a few questions, but I know that we also have an eager audience. So I'm going to hold back mine, and if there is time, I'll come back to mine, and we can also open up to all of our panelists. I just want to make sure that I take a few questions from the audience. And one question, very specific question that comes up here to you, Khatchig, is whether you can say something about the Greeks and their role in assisting the Armenian community.
Yes, thank you for the question. In the area that I'm covering, and I cover, I would say, a triangle between Aleppo, ul-Ain, and Deir ez-Zor. There are several Christian communities that I do address, including small Greek communities and their role, starting with Aleppo, where the local church organizes a fundraising for the Armenian deportees. We know from Ottoman documents as well as from Armenian minutes of meetings, etc., about the role of the Greek church in that regard. We also know individuals, Greek individuals, who play a critical role in assisting deportees in regions such as Deir ez-Zor and elsewhere. Some locals, just very few, and some who actually were from Lebanon and elsewhere. In terms of Greeks, we also have some interesting accounts that I use in the book by Greeks who are witnessing what happens and try to what is happening and are documenting it. In the book, of course, there's another book to be written about the role of these that really focuses on the way in which locals, Armenians, Greeks, particularly Greeks, Jews, Arabs, Muslims in general, are assisting this effort. But in many ways, and that is not something I focused on, and I didn't have the source base to do it. So much of what I glean comes from the Armenian, Ottoman, and Western sources that I use in terms of trying to understand this. Another quick addition to this is that there's also, it's important to note that the Greeks and the Syrians were also victimized as part of this process. And in many ways, their experience, the experience of the Pontic Greeks in many ways parallels this all the way to Aleppo. A 1-minute story. Years ago, again, Peggy mentioned my, in a previous lifetime, I was a journalist, and I interviewed an author who had written a book on the Greek, Pontic Greek and Assyrian experiences, a memoir called Not Even My Name, Thea Halo. And I was walking out from my office and I saw, the copy editors were copy editing this interview that I had done. And I saw one of the copy editors crying. And I asked her, what's going on? And she said, well, this woman's story of, she was Pontic Greek, is the story of my mother. My mother, was among those who were deported, Pontic Greek, ends up in Aleppo, ends up in an Armenian orphanage, eventually marries the principal, the Armenian principal of that orphanage years later, and assimilates into the Armenian community. But she was talking about how her mother always, whenever she remembered or listened to or heard Greek songs, it was, she was transported into, her ancestral town and homeland. So this is, these experiences are really interwoven, and there's like these layers that are not, that would be wonderful to really unpack in terms of this kind of, these experiences that brought these communities together.
Thank you. We have another question that draws back on Elise's question about whether you can draw some parallels between your account of the events of the Armenian Genocide and the more recent ethnic cleansing or events in Azerbaijan and the recent conflict.
Yes. So in many ways, and this is of course critical, it is impossible to, for Armenians to witness what they have witnessed over the past months during the war, particularly with the role being played by an unrepentant denialist state in arming, often directing militarily this campaign during a pandemic on the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. It is impossible for Armenians not to draw this connection with the past, right? That is critical. But at the same time, I would be very careful about comparing it to the Armenian genocide uncritically. So that is another criticism that I would bring here. And of course, you know, I can speak at length about this, but ultimately, it is important to see the role of a denialist, unrepentant, continuously aggressive Turkish state, and the way in which, in fact, the denial of the genocide, its failure to confront it, continues to impact these policies. And on the one hand, that is critical, but on the other hand, it's in terms of terminology, I do not refer to it as genocide. So that's where I stand. To be brief, I can say a lot more and in a more nuanced way, but I wanted to just make it a one-sentence response.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question now from the audience, which is goes back to Professor Anderson's question about the role of Jamal Pasha, and if you could say something about that.
Yes. Again, this will be tricky to summarize. Jamal Pasha is one of those characters that has been called both in the scholarship and public discourse, everything from savior to perpetrator of genocide. And most of the positions that we have fall in the either and or. In fact, one of the perhaps the most radical criticisms of Jamal Pasha was the fact that he was assassinated by an Armenian group who went out to avenge the perpetrators of the genocide. So in many ways, starting from that extreme form of criticism, right, all the way into people talking about him as the savior of Armenians in Syria, right? What I try to introduce is an approach that really sees Jamal Pasha as both in a certain way, in a sense that I say, yes, he was pursuing the genocidal policies that are coming down, but at the same time, because of his network, and because he also needs to get certain things done, and as he needs certain things done, he needs the most important hospital in his region to work with. He needs the most important hotel where his officers are staying, where he is staying to work with. He's also doing these favors to these people who he is close to. So when we think about this, it becomes a challenge to reconcile this with him advancing or following the policies that is coming from the center. But at the same time, it is possible for one person to do both, right? And I do articulate this in the book. I had more time to do it over there, but that's perhaps the gist of it.
Thank you. I do want to take, I'm going to grab my opportunity here as chair, just to first thank everybody, audience and panelists. I did want to say, Khatchig, that it's interesting. The first time I read your book, I sort of, I mean, I got the point, of course, and I saw how important it is. After this conversation today, and hearing all the perspectives, I thought that one thing you perhaps could really even elaborate on, if you so wish, is the fact that there is really something about, and it came out in a lot of the presentations of our speakers, there is a notion today, I believe, a very strong one, in which the political imagination we have still conceptualizes sort of the proof of victimhood lies on the victim. And therefore, the more victim one is, the more chances are that one would be recognized as such. And it's, as people were speaking today, Hamid and Margaret and Elise, I realized that it's quite remarkable actually how profound it is, because the idea that, you know, if there is no resistance, then we can really claim that there was a genocide, right? And if, say, in a completely different context, the victim of rape is completely paralyzed, then there's, you know, if that person has resisted, then maybe it wasn't rape after all, etc. Right? So there is, I think, something really profound that you're touching on here, and it made me think, and I will end here, was the fact that if you realize the model in genocide studies following Agamben's reading of Primo Levi, which I think is the worst reading possible of Primo Levi, but somehow it became the most modeled reading, is that somehow the model of the victim is the homo sacer. That if you want to prove victimhood, of course, there should be no violent, heaven forbid, you know, the victim violently opposes, but no, it has to be no agency whatsoever, something you actually do not find in Primo Levi at all. So it's not so much actually a question, I realize, but a reflection and a sort of, but a gratitude to you, because I realize how important ethically and theoretically it is to allow victims to have agency of resistance and remain victims, that human in victimhood, not homo sacer, which is the precisely the sort of the fetishization of a sort of complete victim, ultimate victim, right? So I don't know if you want to reflect on it, but for me, this was the outcome of this conversation. So I want to thank all of you, because I didn't have this epiphany until tonight.
Yes, thank you. May I just say one word about that? Because
you are encouraged.
You articulated it, well, my one word is up. You articulated it so well, Gil, and in many ways, it's interesting, because at some point, the victim group, the targeted group, actually looks at it and says, well, you know, well, this is the narrative now. Let me see how it works if I just adopt it. So the humanitarianism aspect is one such example. In the case of the Armenian community over the past several years, there were these huge campaigns of thanking America for its contribution, right? Because it was a way in which to remind Americans that, you know, you had all these heroes. Your grandparents were heroes that saved Armenians. Now your government should recognize the genocide, right? While at the same time, we live among the children and grandchildren of these people who actually died, were killed, being part of this network. And we don't really pay attention to it. It is an interesting component that really complicates the way in which even the victim at some point tries to reflect on this. It's also important to think about the fact that oftentimes many of these narratives are shaped by you know, the perpetrator society and beyond, by humanitarians and others, while the targeted group is trying to rebuild and put the pieces together, right? It takes that takes a generation or two, after which you have these ossified, you know, ideas, and it becomes it becomes a situation where often people will just say, you know what, you know, let me do it from within the system, right? And that sort of is again one of the paradoxes of what is going on in this case as well. So thank you so much. That was a very important point as we reflect on this. And thank you everyone for.
If I may add, there's just one point to what Gil said, brilliant point of Gil. The way that Khatchig prevents this total victimization is actually one of the best moves of the narrative when he talks about Armenian profiteers and Armenian collaborationists and non-Armenian supporters within the network. So in this absolutely brilliant move, he de-essentializes and de-ethnicizes the horror of the thing, not diminishes. By de-ethnicizing it, in fact, he underlines the horror of the genocide. That, in my opinion, is one of the best narrative moves of the book.
Absolutely. So it is 7:30. I do want to thank all of you, all of the participants, the panelists, wonderful conversation. I also do want to draw attention to the fact that the book is available and 20% off, and that the link is there. I got a cue. Unless any of the panelists want to add a word, please. This is.
Well, this is the point. Ordinarily, we go to Pistici and have my wish to come true to be an Armenian bartender.
That's true. We are going to take advantage of this, Hamid. This is I wrote it down. This is gonna long live this dream. We're gonna make this dream come true. The minute this virus leaves us in peace already, we will take care of that.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
I will raise a glass from California.
Well, thank you so much to all of you. Wonderful panelists, wonderful interaction. Thank you for the invisible audience. We know you're there. We see the numbers, and thank you for your questions. And thank you, Khatchig, for the book and for your engagement. And have all of you a wonderful evening, afternoon in California. For the rest of us, dark night.
Good night.